Welcome to StudioCloud's tutorial on setting up your entire workflow using the Workflow Manager. This tutorial is broken down into the following 4 sections. What is the Workflow Manager? How to use the Workflow Manager? Examples of different workflows? Tips on setting up workflow. The Workflow Manager lets you set up a workflow that can include any of the following items: lead tracking workflow, lead consultation workflow, session workflow, sales session workflow, and order tracking. Here is a breakdown of each workflow. Please note that each workflow is optional. You would only use the workflow that you need for your specific needs. Lead tracking workflow. Lead tracking is used to track potential customers and convert them to paying customers. Lead tracking is for potential customers that you are actively working with and not for potential customers that you will be marketing to in the future. Lead consultation workflow. Lead consultation workflow is for situations where you schedule a phone call or an in-person appointment with the client. If you are doing phone consultations that are not scheduled on the calendar, then you should use the lead tracking workflow and not this workflow. Session workflow. Session workflow is for anything related to the session that happens before or after the session, event, or appointment, but is related to the session. This includes confirmation emails, automatic emails, and text messages, as well as pipeline stages and scheduled messages. Sales session workflow. Sales session workflow is for anything that happens before or after the sales session. Order tracking. Order tracking workflow is for anything that happens after the invoice is created. Next, we're going to discuss how to get to the Workflow Manager and how to create a new workflow. To get to the Workflow Manager, click on the Settings component, then click the Workflow Manager button. To create a new workflow, click the New Workflow button. This box here is the Workflow Options section. We want to start with everything here unchecked so we can just focus on these first options. First, we will enter the name Basic Workflow. Then a description. This is a workflow that only includes lead tracking and order tracking. Then we're going to select the default workflow checkbox. The default workflow checkbox is used if you want this workflow to be automatically selected when you view the workflow. Under the Setup Workflow header are the workflow options. As you select them, they will appear. First, we're going to select Lead Tracking Workflow. The workflow is designed so that the workflow items go from left to right. Then we will select Setup Order Tracking Workflow. For example, in this situation, the lead tracking would happen first and then the order tracking would occur next. Both lead tracking and order tracking have the same options. You can select their default pipelines. You can select a different pipeline, or you can create a new pipeline. When a pipeline is selected, an information box appears with a summary of all of the pipeline stages and their actions. So first, we will click Select Default Lead Pipeline. If you need to switch to a different pipeline or make changes to this pipeline, click on the Actions menu and select the desired menu item. All of the workflow items show an information box once a selection has been made. Next, we'll click Select Default Order Pipeline. We have verified that all of the pipeline stages are set up correctly and the workflow is ready to be saved. So we'll go ahead and click the Save button. We can see the basic workflow information is here. We'll close this window and then we'll go to Workflow and we can see Basic Workflow is selected. This button here allows us to refresh the workflow information. You can see as I move my mouse over these different stages, I can click and select one of these workflow items. So for example, client Shannon Adams is currently in the pipeline stage Touch Up Images. We have finished touching up the images for her order. So we'll click there and we can say Complete Stage. Now the next stage, Send to Print Lab, is marked as active. If we go back here, that has already moved to Send to Print Lab. Now we are going to look at some more examples of different workflows. The first example is a session workflow. We'll begin by typing in the name, session workflow, and a description. This is a workflow for a session. We'll go ahead and click the default workflow button, and we'll leave lead tracking, session workflow, and order tracking workflow all checked. We will uncheck sales session workflow for now. Then we're going to click select default lead pipeline and default order pipeline. When setting up the calendar, the most important item to set up is the calendar type. With workflow, the same principle applies. The calendar type is used to decide what workflow should be used. When doing workflow that involves the calendar, it always centers around the calendar type. The calendar types are the brains for each item on the calendar. In the session workflow view, we are looking at the workflow for a calendar. The button here is labeled Select Session Calendar Type. If you have a calendar type called Session, it will automatically select it. If your calendar type is named anything else, you will need to click the Select Existing Calendar Type button, and then select the calendar type you want to use. If you need to create or edit any of the calendar types, you can click the Manage Calendar Types button. In our situation, the calendar type is named Session, so we will click the first button. The information here shows the session workflow, which is different than the information for lead tracking and order tracking. The session information box contains the following information. Under the Actions When Session Booked section, it shows which actions will automatically occur when the session is booked. In this situation, it is set up for the leads to be converted to clients and for the lead pipelines to be automatically marked as completed when the session is booked. Under the Confirmation Emails and Text Messages section, it shows which emails and texts will be sent to the client when the session is booked. Under the Active Cloud Alert Emails and Text Messages section, it shows the automatic emails and text messages that are set up to be sent to a client. Under the Pipeline section, it shows all of the pipeline stages and their actions. Next, we're going to add in the sales session to this workflow. So we'll come over here and we'll click Set Up Sales Session Workflow. Because we already have a calendar type named Sales Session, we will click the Select Sales Session Calendar Type button. Otherwise, we would need to click the Select Existing Calendar Type and select the Sales Session. Here is a basic summary of how this workflow works. First, lead workflow. If the client is not interested, then they are moved to be a prospective client, and the pipeline is marked completed using the final pipeline stage. If the client is interested, then they are automatically converted to be a client when the session is booked and the lead pipeline is automatically marked completed. Next, session workflow. When the session is booked, the confirmation emails are sent and the pipeline stages are stepped through. This workflow assumes that the session and sales session are scheduled at the same time. If they aren't, then StudioCloud recommends adding a pipeline stage called Schedule Sales Session at the end of the session workflow. In addition, StudioCloud recommends that you set up the sales session to automatically mark the session pipeline as completed when it is scheduled to really streamline this workflow. You can set up that option by clicking on the Sales Session Actions menu and selecting Edit Sales Session Calendar Type. Next, Sales Session Workflow. The sales session workflow occurs after the session. The invoice is created during the sales session. Order workflow. The order workflow starts after the sales session is completed. Another workflow option that is available is the ability to schedule a lead consultation workflow. To do that, we come and click the Set Up Lead Consultation Workflow. The lead consultation could be either a phone consultation or an in-person consultation, but the lead consultation workflow only applies if it is scheduled on the calendar. In other words, if you are doing cold calls to a lead to try and get them to book, that would be a part of the lead pipeline and not the lead consultation pipeline. The goal of the lead consultation is to get the client to book a session. In this workflow, we have a calendar type already called Consultation, so we will click on the Select Consultation Calendar Type. If you are using a different name, make sure to click on the Select Existing Calendar Type button. Here is a basic summary of how this workflow works. The lead tracking is used to get the clients to schedule a lead consultation. Once the client has scheduled a lead consultation, the lead pipeline is automatically marked completed. The lead consultation workflow consists of follow-up phone calls to try and convert the lead to a paying customer. If they don't work, then the pipeline will be marked as completed and the lead will be converted to a prospective client. If it does work and the session is booked, then the lead consultation workflow will automatically be marked as completed due to an option with the session called Other Event Pipelines will be marked completed. You can see that here. This option will automatically mark the lead consultation workflow as completed. If you don't want this option enabled, you can turn it off by clicking on the Session Actions button and then select Edit Sessions Calendar Type. At this point, the workflow continues on like the previous workflow. Finally, we are going to cover some basic workflow setup tips. Tip number 1. All pipeline stages should have a deadline set for them so that they show up on the overview page when it is time for them to be completed. Tip number 2. Pay attention to where pipelines are automatically marked as completed so that you don't add a pipeline stage to a pipeline that is automatically closed. If this is confusing, just turn off the actions to automatically mark pipelines as completed until you feel comfortable with your workflow. Tip number 3. If a client skips a workflow stage, it doesn't matter. For example, if a client calls you directly to schedule a session, there is no need to create the client as a lead. You can skip the lead tracking workflow. Tip number 4. Sometimes it matters which pipeline a pipeline stage goes into, and sometimes it doesn't. Here is an example of a pipeline stage that could go in many different pipelines. If you have a pipeline stage called Upload Images to Social Media, it could occur after the session, before the sales session, after the sales session, or during the order workflow. If you upload images that are touched up before the sales session, then the pipeline stage should be part of the sales session. If you upload the touched up image that the client orders, then the pipeline stage would need to be a part of the order pipeline. If you upload images directly from the session without touching them up, then the pipeline stage could be a part of any of the pipelines. This concludes the workflow overview. Please refer to the individual lead, session, and order pipeline videos for specific steps on setting up the pipelines for each of those.